how can I start? I tend to not believe the literature, and I tend to try to explore on my own to figure things out. As was said earlier, you got to know what you're trying to do and what the risks are. And trying to figure out data governance, the folks around me at the University of Virginia were going to Gartner and other places and finding what they've written down. And okay, that's fine, but for me, I tried to think, what is it that we need to do? Where do we need to start? It turns out that where we need to start is an inventory of our data. We don't have an inventory of our research data. Research data is under people's desks, it's in the closets, it's on thumb drives, and we don't have an inventory. So if you don't have an inventory, you don't know who owns the data, which is one of the other aspects of it. You don't know what the data looks like, so a data catalog to be able to explain it to people. And you don't understand the constraints on it, which is what governance is all about in some ways, is how to maintain the privacy. There's probably a couple other things I could come up with, but this whole thing started when I said, well, what data do we have? And on the administrative side, we have the 35 data sets documented that are there for compliance with federal laws, reporting on our students and things like this. And it's not a known function, so that's a significant amount of data, right? So we don't have an inventory, and we don't have the rest of the things, the ownership, the uses and so forth. And this has been informing my whole process. We have a lot of storage. We have a lot of storage devices. I think Matter said, lots and lots of storage. That's one piece of it, but how do you build on top of that the layers that allow you to understand the rest of those functions of governance? And if you don't understand what you've got, how can you understand the privacy aspects? And how do you know it's not if you get hacked, it's when you get hacked, what you've lost? And so how do you do reporting over what you've lost if you don't even understand what you've lost? So
pivot down a little bit. I'll use the CMMI scale. 1 is somebody somewhere in your organization has done something. 2, an organization somewhere in your organization has done something. 3 is your whole organization does something. 4 is your organization measures what they do, and 5 is they actually use what they measure. That's CMMI in a nutshell. If you remember nothing else, remember that. Most places are 2. There are organizations within the larger organization that have a better practice or a more broad practice around data management. Most places, per force, through the privacy regulations, are going to level 3 because you need to have these practices across the board. If you don't know what you have, if you don't know where it is, you're very unlikely to be able to govern anything. It's knowing what you have. And it's always, and I'm going to take a pivot in that I never approve data. I know that sounds really weird, but I don't look at approving someone for data. I approve the use. We have a data use review. We do not review, we don't say, this person can have this data. What we say is, this use of the data is appropriate. And these are the controls and the constraints around that use, making sure that we have the appropriate consent in place to use that data. So it's making that pivot to not really thinking so much about what, do I give this person the data, but is the use appropriate? Do we have a legal basis for processing for the GDPR people out here? And that, to me, that's the heart of it. Otherwise, if I just tell you, oh, you can use this, here's the data, you're approved for this data, I don't know what you're doing with it. So I really don't know if it's appropriate.
Okay. So the last question is a little bit like saying, what do your clients eat when they go to McDonald's? Well, it's hamburgers. So what do our clients do when we come to them is we build knowledge graphs for them. So all of our clients are coming to us because they want knowledge graphs. So why do they want knowledge graphs? By the way, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Why do they want knowledge graphs? Well, the main thing is the data is in silos everywhere. Has anybody seen a data silo?
That has a cell phone here has this data silo, I guess.
Right. So we just gave a talk yesterday. There's a data architecture summit in Chicago, and I gave a talk with our client at Morgan Stanley. We're working in their risk department. So in risk, they track a lot of different things. What goes wrong, actual incidents, what gave rise to that thing going wrong, which they call issues. And then they track different categories of risk. They have taxonomies for risks, for processes, and they put controls in place to make the bad things much less likely to happen. And it was all in silos. They had application for issues, application for incidents, application for controls, a lot of different applications. But if you have a question that says, you know, what kind of things are going wrong in this region, or what process, what technology assets support this process that supports this other process in this region, then when there's a big storm in lower Manhattan, you know what is affected by what. Okay, so you have risks, all kinds of things. So the real reason most of our clients are building knowledge graphs is to connect the dots, to get rid of the silos. So what we do is we go into each application, and then we build a core semantic model, which is called an ontology. And that serves as the metadata, not for one database, for one application, but for all the applications. Right now, you have one application, one database, one metadata. And you could have 6 applications all doing the same thing, HR or diseases or whatever but they have different data models. The technology doesn't allow sharing of data models for relational. So that's a short introduction to what we do and why we do it.
In some ways, the CI/CD, it just accelerates a problem you may or may not have. It doesn't really change whether you have the problem or not. It just changes how visible it is. And in this space, you know, one of the things I say all the time, people who know me know this is one of my favorite sayings. The important things are simple, the simple things are hard. And it's about basic discipline. You know, I made myself extremely popular at Starbucks when I first got there because I put my foot down and said, you're not putting anything in the data lake that doesn't have a mapping spec, period. They loved me. You know, the functional analysts just loved me for that. But if you don't do that basic, then you don't know what you have. If you don't know what you have, you don't know what it is. If you're rapidly deploying on top of uncertainty, you know, you're only accelerating uncertainty. You're not really. So the basic discipline about making sure that the data people use has definitions that they can understand is important. On top of that, though, you can't hide those definitions under a rock somewhere. You have to have a metadata management tool. You have to have portals that make metadata accessible to, you know, people who don't do this, you know, all week, all day. You have to really get not only the data democratized, you have to get the metadata democratized. Because it comes down to basic hardware and software are easy. Liveware is really tough. And what you really need to change is how people use the metadata, how people understand what they're doing. More so than any particular technology that's going to, you know, jump out of some box and say, I'm going to save you. You know, the people have to save themselves.
I could keep going on and on, but I'll stop there for now.
I think there's another part of this from the information architecture standpoint. You know, one of the things I do is I have subject areas and minor subject areas across Starbucks. And you design those in order to enable governance, enable access control, so that you can actually make it real to the business. You know, rule number 1, IT does not control access, business controls access. Because IT never really is in the right place to understand use. But if you have those subject areas, you can assign the subject areas, either minor or major, to a business person and say, okay, for store data, you are the person who owns store data. So any of the access, you know, you either have to delegate that or grant that yourself. You have to understand that. For legal, you have to do that. So that you really empower the business to help you do that control. If you try to do that across a large organization without an architecture for it, it becomes sedimentary in nature where things just settle out in the water. And that never ends well.
So the corollary to that, we started talking about at UVA about a chief data architect. And we came to the conclusion that a chief data architect is not a technology person, it's a business person. But they have to speak the language of the technology.
Wow, great. Question here. Anybody else raise their hand so I can move it after that?
Great insights. Thank you for great insights. Thank you for sharing. You know, as I mentioned previously, I'm in healthcare, and we are sort of embarking on a journey as it pertains to data management, master data management, reference data management. So we are facing a lot of challenges because in healthcare, data is messy, it's extremely fragmented, it's not harmonized, it's in silos. There is a lot of privacy, so on and so forth. Sparse, exactly. So you think of all kinds of adjectives in the negative way to sort of describe it, and it's a great opportunity for all of us. So can you please tell me, when things are messy, things are fragmented, and things are siloed, how do you where do you start, how do you start, and how do you sort of demonstrate the art of the possible to the organization so that you can actually create buy-in to move forward? It's not about the technology as much. It's more about change management, transformation, how people can think differently. So can you tell me a little bit? It's not the technology. I can't remember, but this is an anonymous quote. Somebody said, if you think that technology can take care of your problem, then you don't understand the technology and you don't understand the problem. and so, especially in a context like this, what I just described to you, can you share with me some insights in terms of what has worked well for you, what has not worked well for you, so that I can go back and try some things in a thoughtful, deliberate fashion. Thank
Is that
you.
a question to any one of us in particular?
Anyone? You want to take it?
Sure, I'll start.
No, just start, please.
So yes, you're exactly right. It's not a technology problem completely. However, it is the case that the technology as it is a driver for silos. So there's certain things in the current technology which make silos just happen.
Yeah.
And the main thing that causes that, there's a few factors, but probably the main one is there aren't any global URIs. There aren't any global identifiers, so that you exist in one database as Johnny Smith, and you exist maybe in healthcare. So you're a doctor, but you're also an employee. So you're in the doctor's database, you're in the employee database, but maybe you have a big company and they also have their own health insurance. Now you're a member of the health insurance plan. So you exist in 3 different places. And there's 3 different databases and they're modeled differently. So technology is a driver for the problem. But it's also human laziness. It's always faster to do something here and now and get it out the door, and there's always pressure, right? So we face that. I'm trying to get back to your real question. What have we learned, and what could you go back with? One thing is start somewhere that's small enough to be manageable, but large enough to demonstrate value. So like in the example with this, with the commodities pricing company we work with, they really had a problem with their regions. And we just went in there and we sorted it out for them. And we have a little demo that shows how it works and how it can connect together. And they start getting it. They see, okay, I get that. Now what we're seeing in the last few years, which wasn't true 5 or 10 years ago, is we don't have to sell this technology anymore. We don't have to go in there and quote all these benefits. They're coming to us. So they already get that there's the value, but then they have to prove to their managers and CEOs, show me the value. So they get it, but then we still have to show the value. So start small, and then evolve it gradually out. So that's what I would say.
And find somebody who inherited the problem but didn't cause it as your sponsor.
Oh, that's good.
That's a firefighter's answer.
Good. I like that.
Because they're really invested, but they're not emotionally ashamed of it, because you want them to be part of the solution. Getting the right business owner for a problem is such a large part of the solution. And something else you hit on is, I have 4 rules about data. Care about naming, care about definition, care about identity, and something can only mean one thing. There's a fifth, the suspicious of one-to-one relationships.
It's like the Monty Python and the Spanish Inquisition, right? There's a 6th coming as well.
But understanding identity across your organization, there's nothing it is such an impediment to making progress in your organization if you don't have identity brought together, because identity is not an intrinsic property. Identity exists in a context. And if you don't have identity across all your enterprise figured out, you can only do things in a single context, and it really prevents you from bringing things together.
So just to jump in, I was hired into UVA. My directions from the president were to create a technology strategy for the university. I pushed back and said, a technology strategy doesn't make sense. Technology is to support the strategies of the university. And so we have an education strategy, we have a research strategy, we have a business strategy, and technology supports that. So this is why you said technology doesn't solve the problem. I think if you know what the problem is, then technology can help. To continue the story a little bit, I went into the chief operating officer's office and said, I'm pushing on this new business strategy for us, using the term the data-enabled university. I started with the data-driven university, and the president said, that sounds too harsh. Let's talk about data-enabled. And he said, oh, we're using data already. Well, what he meant was he asks a question and wants some data, and they go turn in a query, somebody issues the query, and about 3 weeks later, they get an Excel spreadsheet back with the data on it.
Exactly.
And what's the first thing that you do when you see the results of a query? You say, well, what if I...
Oh, of course.
And you have to do the next query, right? And so that's another 3 weeks to get that back. And that's the first step, is to get an example of why you want to do this. This person didn't know. It's like when FedEx invented overnight package delivery, there was no need for it. They had to generate the need. Now I get trash mail delivered overnight because it's so easy, right? So you have to generate the need. What I found was there's the first example came out of our student affairs folks around students flourishing, which is really a high thing for us, right? So if you think about it, transfer students into a university are at a disadvantage from people who matriculate first year. But why? There's a bunch of different reasons, but what our student affairs folks said is, we've got these 5 different data sets, but we don't have a single way of querying all 5. We don't know how to get the data from them, and a different person owns the data. And I said, wait, the university owns the data. And they said, oh. So you go to the person, and the person gives you the Virginia no. But if you can figure out, then you step up to the governance. I'm rambling a little bit now, but you get the point is, until they know they have a problem, you can't solve the problem.
I think in the graph world, it's called a tree of trees, right? So, or the tree in the forest. But yeah, there was a question, gentleman here in the middle.
Yeah, I'm going to ask a somewhat heretical question.
Okay.
There is no heretics.
But it's based on experience. And I'm talking about frugality. So in terms of, managing data or managing risk, what if we didn't collect everything just because we could? And we just basically said it's going to have a granularity based on what we understand the problem to be and no more. It's a bit like, I'm not a technologist, but if you're writing code, in the early days, I think you would write millions and millions of lines of an operating system's code because it was easy. And it could be messy and sort of not very clean and sort of sharp because you could get away with it. Now, it seems to me that there's an analogy here with data, because I've worked in the South Pacific where we were collecting data and we would have to get a French satellite to change its trajectory in order to fly over the islands. And we didn't have the money and we didn't have the time. And so we kind of said, well, we need vegetation as an example, but we don't have it. Or habitat, and we don't have it, so let's look at vegetation. We didn't have vegetation, so let's look at soils, because all of them are connected, and then we figured out a way to backfill it. The point being is that, if we wanted to manage risk, wouldn't we be better off starting by saying, here's the problem definition for which we need data, and let's just collect it at the resolution at which it's needed, so we don't have to store as much and we don't have to manage as much. That kind of frugality doesn't exist in the mindset because it's just so easy. And I'm wondering if I'm thinking completely something wrong.
One of the basic principles of privacy by design is data minimization. They don't get it unless, where I work, you don't get it unless you demonstrate a use. Once you demonstrate a use, we have a discussion about, okay, how long are you going to keep it? When are you going to be done with it? How do you guarantee it's going to be really gone once it's done? So do not, I think it was Sharon who really jumped in on this one hard, is don't collect anything you don't need. Collect as little as you need for it and keep it as short a time as possible. you can't breach what you don't have. You don't have to delete what you don't have. You don't have to provide to the data subject what you don't have. It solves a lot of problems just by, the principle of data minimization.
There's a theory that's becoming more popular. So most machine learning people think that, thank you for elucidating the difference between general AI and specific AI, that probabilistic inference is the way to go. But in healthcare, that can kill people because you don't understand what probability means. It's all about variance. And there's a new movement called causal inference. I think Archis mentioned some of those principles. Ask the right question first. Understand which variables are important, and then perturb the variables, and then observe. Actually, observational data, negative data is also very important in clinical trials, for example. So, any thoughts there, Michael?
Yeah,
Yes.
I'd like to address your comment and agree completely with what Art said, and to sum it up by saying less is more, right? So, and you're speaking from the perspective of collecting all the data, and don't collect it if you don't need it. We have the experience from a different perspective. We go into companies, like we went into a large electrical products company, and they wanted to capture the specifications of their products, voltage regulators and these boxes, circuit boxes you put in a house, and giant things that go into nuclear power plants. They have it all. So they said, let's try building out a knowledge graph and hold that data instead of the relational data. And what we found was, and we have found this multiple times in multiple companies, the actual data that they need for given purposes is a small percentage, 10 to 20%. All the other stuff is cruft. A lot of it's just old, and everybody who looked at it would say, oh, we don't use it anymore. But nobody takes the time to get rid of it because they're afraid some application somewhere might need it. So just a comment. But yeah, less is more, absolutely.
So I'm going to challenge it just a little bit, if I could, just real quick. We're doing a project using the network data for the university and a security framework, looking to find attacks before the 0 day. And you don't know what you're looking for. And so we're keeping a lot of the data because once we find what we're going to look for, it's easier to go back and on the data that we have longitudinally find the thing we're looking for multiple times. So I think there is a sense of the frugality, but there's also the flip side of that, which is sometimes you don't know what you're looking for and you keep the data until you do know what you're looking for.